Hello and welcome. I'm Val Jonas, CEO of Risk Decisions Group. Thank you for joining my presentation today, 2020 Vision, the Art of Risk Intelligent Decision Making. We live in uncertain times. The pace of change grows ever faster. Risk permeates all our lives. And this is why risk intelligent decision making is more important than ever. Hence today's presentation. I'm going to offer you some thoughts on what you might do to embed risk intelligent thinking to make better decisions. So, to our agenda. First up, I'm going to introduce you to my personal view of risk-based decision making. Then we'll talk about risk intelligence and leadership and what good decision making looks like. Finally, I'll talk about putting it all into practice, how to engage in making risk a powerful force for good, driving success through your organisation. So let's start with understanding decision making. How do we use decisions to shape future success? You can see from the dictionary definition, decisions require consideration, but consideration takes time. On our winding journey to the future, we will encounter unknowns. We'll need to make timely decisions along the way. Later in this presentation, I'll cover an interesting McKinsey survey showing how time is of the essence, that speedy decision making is key to success. So, how can we best prepare ourselves for this? This is where 2020 Vision comes in. So, we're standing here today with an idea of what we want to do, what we want to achieve. I'm going to share some thoughts on a technique we can use to prepare us for speedy decision making. Let's look at this little person in the top right-hand corner of our screen, teleported into the future. I use this technique quite often, where I imagine what the outcome will be. What do I want to achieve? And pretend I've already got there, and I'm looking back with 2020 hindsight. That I already know how we got here, the problems we overcame, the decisions we needed to take. That puts me in a better position to make a plan. Stepping back into the present, I take into account what might happen along the way, understanding the uncertainty and risk that might occur, how we're going to manage it, and also how are we going to make sure we're prepared for opportunities that come our way. I use this technique in my personal life too. For example, when planning a holiday. I enjoy holidays 3 times over. I enjoy the planning, imagining the future. Of course, I actually like being on holiday, and I really enjoy when I come back looking at the photos and remembering all the great memories. Instead of seeing this winding road full of negative uncertainty and risk, I embrace the future in anticipation of enjoying the positive feeling of success at the end of it. So what are the prerequisites for a good decision maker? Well, first of all, I think you need to be curious. You need to be ready to explore and be innovative. You also need to be ready for whatever might happen, be open-minded, listen to others, understand other people's perspectives. As we saw with my journey and teleportation, you also need imagination. Think about the future scenarios. What could happen? What might happen that you don't want to happen? Make sure that you understand all the different potential options that you could take. Courage and conviction, and not being afraid to speak up. Too often we have people in our organisations that know about risk, know about uncertainties, know how to achieve things, and they don't speak up. Have courage. And finally, honesty. We need to trust each other and work together if we're going to achieve great things. And finally, we need risk intelligence, and that's what I'm going to go on to talk about now in my next section. Risk is part of our everyday lives. Some people talk about uncertainty being the new normal. It's in the news, we hear politicians, scientists, healthcare professionals. Risk has slipped into our everyday language. While we're getting practiced at personal risk, unfortunately, we seem to still be not so good at company risk in our organisations, in our jobs. So we decided to tackle this thing called risk intelligence. We asked some risk intelligent people, in our views, to share their ideas with us, share their wisdom, to see if they could help us and help others understand how to take the leadership on risk. One of the problems is life is inherently risky. There's no such thing as a deterministic strategy. We all know from ISO 31000 that we need to set objectives and understand what the uncertainties are that might happen and hit our objectives. We need to create strategies, but unfortunately, we tend to do that without taking risk and uncertainty into account until afterwards, after we've set the strategy, we're fixed on what we're going to do, and we end up with unrealistic plans, and sometimes no plan at all, just an idea of what we want to achieve. As Andrew Pike says, there's no such thing as a deterministic strategy. So let's consider, why is it that people don't consider risk, or at least not until it's too late? Our conclusion is that risk has a PR problem, and we need to change that. After all, a ship in harbour is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. And as Emma Bradley says, we need to celebrate smart risk-taking, not prevent it. So we looked at why risk has a bad PR problem and came to the conclusion that when people think of risk, and particularly risk management, they think of a lot of negative words. It conjures up a negative ideas. So we looked at all the words that come to your mind when you talk about risk. Of course, insurance, a lot of people think about insurance or compliance, protecting, losses. They think about the unexpected, and that's kind of scary, especially in your job, in your career. Damage, disaster, and a lot of managers think that risk is something to be prevented, not to be embraced. Instead of seeing it as something as positive, they see it as a problem, a challenge. And if you don't if you don't manage risk, then it's been a failure. So we decided it was time we turned this on its head and instead try to encourage people to think about risk in a much more positive way. To talk about embracing risk, to be strategic, think of the future, have vision. Innovation is a major part of a lot of companies' statements on their website now. They want to be innovative. How about taking a competitive advantage, being curious, curiosity? What are the possibilities? How do we instill confidence in our teams, our customers? Interestingly, as we were working on this, I decided that when I met somebody and they asked me, what do you do? I decided, instead of say, I'm in risk management, I decided to say, I'm in risk. It was a transformation for me, because when I said I'm in risk management, end of conversation. People decided, don't want to talk to this person. But actually, when I just said I'm in risk, generally the response was, oh, what kind of risk? What do you do? And so it opens up so many conversations. And I found that we ended up in a much more exciting conversation. So, what is it that makes a risk intelligent leader? A good place to start, I think, is thinking out of the box. So take, for example, disruption. Companies like Uber and Airbnb have come out of nowhere and hit the market. They've transformed their sectors. Whether or not you like their business model, getting a taxi now is a whole new experience. I spent some time in Johannesburg a little while ago, and that was when I started using Uber. And it has transformed the lives of people in Johannesburg, a very dangerous place to live. But knowing you can get in a taxi, which is tracked, you know who's picking you up, There you can have somebody else track where you're going. You know exactly how much you're going to pay. Particularly for women, it's transformed their lives. And there are now alternatives to Uber all over the place. It's upped the game in the industry. Another example is startups, entrepreneurs who are prepared to risk everything to achieve their goal. As Horst Simon says here, risk intelligent leaders understand on a deep level, the higher the risk, the higher the reward. The flip side is that risk averse leaders actually expose their organisations to risk, as Pete Madsen says. One of my favourite sayings as well is, as Emma Bradley says here, safe is risky and risky is safe. At the start, I talked about risk as being a positive force for good. Risk is a catalyst for creativity. One of my favourite sayings of all is this one by Wayne Gretzky. You'll always miss 100% of the shots you don't take. When times are tough, we have to get creative. Sometimes it's forced on us. So, for example, right now, we're in an unprecedented situation where organisations, the pharmaceutical industry, are creating vaccines that typically take years and years to develop and bring to market. They're doing it in record time. It's because we face a situation where we have to do it. And human beings are ingenious. If we work together, we can do amazing things. Similarly, during the first wave of COVID, we had vacuum cleaner companies making ventilators, we had school tech teachers making face visors and other PPE. Our lives have been transformed, and businesses too. Restaurants have morphed into takeaway outlets, pubs have turned into shops. People who never thought they would sign up to shopping delivery or buying online or working at home found themselves doing all those things overnight. As Pete Madsen says, when times ahead are hard, we become more creative and innovative. Those organisations that don't survive. I find innovation fascinating. And I think it's time that we've balanced up risk and compliance. So we talk about GRC and ERM and all of those types of things. Now in GRC, setting aside governance, risk and compliance to me are not properly understood. There's been an increasing focus on compliance, which is absolutely vital because it allows you to play the game. If you don't abide by the rules, you're off the pitch. It does, however, involve focusing on control and resilience. Again, another thing in current times is a big focus on resilience. And I think that's really good thing for people to be putting their time and focusing on. However, if you look at the definition of resilience, it's about getting back to where you were. And actually, we live in a time when just getting back to where we were might not be the right thing to do. And if we look at the other side of this, the other axis of this diagram, and look at risk, whereas compliance allows you to be on the pitch, risk is the game-winning strategy. And by risk, we're talking about looking at the downside, deciding what risks to take, what risks not to take. We're looking at how to innovate, and I would say the extension of resilience is pivoting. So we need to think in new ways, in different ways, in order to address some of the challenges that we see today. So finally, our last chapter in the white paper is the curious case of risk culture. You might ask, why curious? Well, I've long thought that we've got a problem that we're quite good generally at managing our personal risk and not so good at managing our company risk. And Risk culture is a very difficult thing to instill in an organisation, especially very large and complex organisations, many of whom spread wider than just their organisation through their contractors, their supply chain. And when things go wrong, there is an automatic response that we often make, which is to blame. And as Emma Bradley says here, ask what didn't work, not who made the mistake, because allowing for failure is essential. My children are now grown up, but when they were teenagers, they needed to make mistakes in order to learn. And what you do is let them make those mistakes, particularly at home. It's how children learn. And one of the stories that I remember somebody telling me about somebody in business, a project manager, he was pretty new, very enthusiastic and working on a project. And unfortunately, the project was a real disaster. So he'd got his breakthrough to take on this responsibility and he'd failed. And he got called into the boss's office and thought, well, this is it. Yeah, fired, demoted. But instead, his boss said, right, we've got a new project coming along, really important. And I think you should be the project manager. So he was completely bowled over. But of course, what it showed was his boss understood that he expected him to have learned from his mistakes and not to make the same mistakes twice. And again, one of my favourite sayings in the white paper, take risks. If you win, you'll be happy. If you lose, you'll be wise. Let's learn from our mistakes. Let's take risks carefully. We need to have the culture of seeing risks as a positive thing and things we can learn from, not something which is seen as a failure. We round up the white paper with the 7 cornerstones of a positive risk culture. Key is your attitude and having good foundations. So attitude, a positive mindset, being creative, those are the kind of strong foundations you need in your organisation. And there are a whole load of other things, communication and trust, being in it together, being stronger together. If you need to solve a problem, it's much easier when you're not on your own. If you're working together and if you've been able to talk, be open and honest, and here having good risk conversations means that actually you can often find there are solutions out there and people are there to help. It's something that people quite enjoy talking about, risk. The problem is when it comes to the hard work of trying to manage it. But if you're doing it together, it can be a lot more fun. Fail fast and learn from your mistakes. And of course, get the board on board. So in conclusion, of course, we're not telling people to go out and just take a load of risks. They need to take calculated risks, because in business, you can't stay where you are. You've got to have that faith that you can launch yourself into the future, whatever it brings. But as Richard Branson says, we must make sure that no one risk is going to topple everything. So we do have to protect the downside, but we also should be looking at what risks can we take, what will give us competitive advantage, how can we innovate, and how can we see a better future. Okay, so we've set the scene in terms of risk intelligence and strategy. I want to come on now to talking about decision making and, in particular, risk-based decisions. To shape the future of risk, we've already talked about setting a positive vision, aligning our company vision and values, and starting from the top, having a risk strategy, so not just a deterministic strategy, and aligning that with your company objectives. But the next step is to cascade it to middle management. Across the business, you need to understand what the outcomes you're aiming for, and making good decision making best practice. Now, last year, McKinsey did a survey of 1,200 managers across global companies. And one of the things that they found was that quality and speed of decision making are both strongly associated with overall company performance. You can see in this some of the results from the survey, and I would definitely recommend you go and read it. The URL is here on the screen. They looked at different types of decisions, and you can see that down the left-hand side. Big bet decisions, those were like the strategic things you do at senior management level. Cross-cutting decisions, very tricky because they are across senior and middle management, across functions, across different divisions or business units, or things that are quite complicated because you need to understand a wider picture and not just take a siloed, myopic approach to understanding what the best decision is. And then the third thing was delegated decisions, going down through the company. And you can see that they asked the managers whether they thought the decisions being made were high quality, high velocity, or both. And it's interesting that the higher up the company, the better quality and speedier decisions they believe they're making. 2/3 of people said that they made big bet decisions with high quality, just over half in a speedy manner. So 44%, both high quality and high velocity. Now that goes down to 1/3 with cross-cutting decisions, and even lower with down to almost 1/4 with delegated decisions. And I thought this was really interesting that they saw it's not just high quality decisions, but high speed decisions as very important. They went on to look at another dimension, and that is the foundational practices that support good decision making. And we can see on this chart, there are 4 plots, but effectively there are 3 foundational practices, and then the right-hand one is the combination of all 3. And this shows that the manager's view, for those that said that they made good quality decisions that were made speedily, and that those decisions resulted in a high return and high value. So first of all, it shows that you're almost 7 times more likely to be successful if you make decisions at the right level through delegation, for example. You are 3 times more likely if you make decisions that align with corporate strategy and you focus the resources on those high value projects. And thirdly, you're 7 times more likely to commit to be successful if you commit to your decisions once they're made. So people have faith that the decision-making process is actually working. But most staggering is that you were 38 times more likely to result in successful outcomes if you applied all 3 of these foundational practices. Now, that's fine. And the most disappointing thing for me with this survey, which was great, decision making in the age of urgency, how what can be more important than that at the moment. But I found it disappointing they didn't include risk in this survey. So I want to go on and have a look at that as an extra dimension, because we look at speed or velocity. They talk about velocity of decision making. Decisions need to be speedy, quality, strategically aligned, should be delegated to the right level, should be committed to carrying them through in order to be successful. If you place risk around the side of this, then risk not only has a likelihood, a velocity, or the uncertainties that might, a risk impact that might hit you, but they also have a velocity. By risk velocity, we mean how long have you got to do something before the risk's going to hit you? So if you realise it's coming towards you, how manageable is it, and have you got the time to manage that risk? If we don't apply risk to our decision making, then we, I think, are missing a trick. One of the organisations that has done some work around in this area is QinetiQ. They actually looked at risk maturity, and I think this study was done over somewhere in the region of 30 projects that they were working with. And they looked at, so along the x-axis, we have them helping upskill projects in risk maturity, and they go through various phases. So at the beginning, a project may be at what we call naive level, and in phase 1, they're moving them to phase 2 to novice level. So instead of the risk process being flawed and not really adding any value, they're actually using it to improve performance against objectives and trying to achieve benefits. Moving on to phase 3, you go into normalized mode, where everything's implemented systematically, it's all consistent, and there is significant value add all the way through to level 4, where it's natural to be doing good risk management. And what they showed is that as you increase maturity, this grey line, from level 1 up to level 4, you decrease your schedule and cost overruns from a level of perhaps overrun or over budget by 100% down to 0 to 10%. And these were working with real projects. Another thing that we think is really important in adding risk to the dimension of decision making is being able to visualize your risks. Too many of us just look at risks in spreadsheets, risk registers, as a list, or maybe a heat map or something like that. But actually, one of the exciting things that we've done recently is to work with a big infrastructure company who were working on a big digital transformation project to produce a new visualization on risk. And this picture shows risks with their impact and velocity, and most importantly, how the risks are linked to each other. So immediately you can visualize those risks that have got a lot of links to other risks. They're the ones that may be influencers or are influenced by many things. And also, this visualization shows different perspectives for risk. In this case, we've chosen to look at the risks by geopolitical category, so we can see what the impact is from an economic point of view, or international relations, or climate change. And we can look at this by slicing and dicing it in any way we want. We might look at it over functional areas. We might look at it by supply chain, for example. So there are all sorts of things that a visualization can help support conversations around risk decision making, including, for example, in this view, the major cyber attack isn't linked to anything. Well, one of the things I'd be asking is why not? Surely that's going to impact the business. So it can also help you improve the quality of risk. And this visualization is dynamic because you can move everything around and reposition it in order to present it in the most useful way to make risk-based decisions. And that needs to be done across the whole organisation, from the executive board down through programs and projects, functions, across to operations, asset management, through the contractor and subcontractor supply chain. You need to be flowing down your risk vision. You need to be feeding back risk-based decisions throughout the organisation, up and down and side to side. So I come on to the final section, looking at risk engagement and how risk is a powerful force for good. So one of the most important things is to have good risk conversations. Unfortunately, spread around the organisation, most risk is done on spreadsheets in most big organisations, all the way down to small organisations, and it's very difficult to know where you're going unless you know where you are now. I do a lot of walking, I like map reading, I can just about use a compass, but a map is no good unless you know where you are today. You need your risk information in a central place because you need to be able to use the type of visualizations across the organisation, and you need real-time availability because speed is of the essence, and if you don't know where you are, then you aren't going to be able to plan and make decisions on where you're going. Similarly, there are significant problems with risk that there's a lot of siloed thinking, specialised risk areas. Of course, those specialised risk areas need to have their own ways of doing things, but they also need to work in collaboration and be able to input into forward-looking insights, not just produce data, but actually understand the trends, understand where you're going. Because risk and the decisions you're making need to be evidence-based. They need to be future-proofed, you need to be agile, and the decisions you're making need to be auditable. So there's quite a step change that a lot of organisations need to make in order to make good risk-based decisions. And of course, it's all about people. We've got this rather strange looking chap at the top of our organisation, and it's his job to make sure that he flows down the objectives, the vision and appetite for risk, and to give people the right authority and responsibility. We talked about delegated decision making from the McKinsey survey, and for people to understand the strategy of how they're going to get there. Down at the coalface, of course, most people are going to be doing a certain amount of tactical risk management, but they still need to have delegated authority to be able to deal with those things. But anything that's important and needs to be highlighted at a higher level, the significant risks need to come up into the middle layer, into middle management, where they're making cross-cutting decisions across programs, balancing budgets, portfolio level. And then, of course, it also needs to come right up to the top with the big hit decisions and strategic risk. Because we need to make good risk-based decisions and build confidence into our organisations. Let's remove the barriers to engagement. Education is fundamental. As Kirsty Cole says at the Australian Submarine Corporation, we put a great deal of thought into how we coach our executive and management teams to lead their respective risk practices, especially around effective communication. We need to make sure that risk is simple. We also need to achieve consistency within our organisation, and we also need transparency. And one of my favourite, again, another of my favourite sayings is Ed Catmull of Pixar. It's not the manager's job to prevent risks, it's the manager's job to make it safe to take them. We need to instill the right risk intelligent mindset and ensure that that is consistent and transparent across the organisation. It's never been a better time to be a risk professional. It's, in my view, and you see it on the internet, a new hot job. As I said earlier, if we start talking about risk and not risk management, then we're able to open up all those conversations, because as risk professionals, we need to come out of the woodwork and become the enabler in these challenging times. And that's at all levels in the organisation. We're not just siloed into individual areas, we're actually working across the organisation as a catalyst to join together all of the different perspectives on risk, balancing risk and compliance, balancing resilience and innovation, and helping our organisations pivot to a new normal. In order to build on the McKinsey survey that shows us that good decisions, quality decisions, need to be speedy decisions, we also need to make them speedy risk decisions. We start at the beginning talking about being curious, open-minded, having imagination, courage and honesty, and overall risk intelligence. And making sure that we understand this balance of being in the game and winning the game. But it's everybody's responsibility. So a normal person's vision is 2020. The difference for somebody who's risk intelligent is that they are able to teleport themselves into the future and give themselves 2020 hindsight to understand how they're going to achieve those outcomes, what is going to happen along the way, how to deal with those things, how to be prepared for any opportunities that they come their way, future gazing now, and looking back with hindsight, we can achieve our goals. And it's everybody's responsibility, because CROs, chief risk officers, whoever's in charge of the respective risk disciplines aren't superhuman. They can't be responsible for all risk, as Horst Simon says. Every employee is a risk manager. In the risk intelligent organisation, you need to start with the vision, the board on board. It's there that you set the policy, you align it to the outcomes that you want for your organisation. So it may be that your risk appetite is that you're a risk-taking organisation, that you embrace risk and try to take as much as possible. It may be that you're a cautious organisation. It depends on what your risk vision is, and that needs to be set from the top, because if you don't understand how much risk you're supposed to be taking, then it's going to be quite difficult for you to know what to do. How do you make decisions when you don't know the parameters within which you're making those decisions are? You need a risk strategy, because you need to know how you're going to achieve that vision for your risk-based decision-making organisation, a risk-intelligent organisation. Frameworks are an interesting one. The framework needs to explain to everyone what their role is, what their accountabilities and responsibilities are, how risk is going to work in the organisation. Reporting is really important. How are you going to make sure that you are giving people either the visualizations or the, not just data, but information to make good decisions on? Looking back at historic performance is not necessarily a good predictor of the future. Of course, you want to learn from experience, but you need to look at trends and visualizations of where you might be going. And you need to implement your risk program. You actually need to have an understanding of how you're going to roll it out, especially across very large and complex organizations. But in the end, risk engagement is really about getting out there and doing it, getting risk champions, showing the way, leading the way, enthusing people with the right mindset, that being engaged in risk is not that thing that is negative and is just going to be something that is brought out to put blame on somebody. But instead, it's the kind of thing that is going to power your organisation with innovation and great thinking on how you're going to shape your future. Because we're not here just to play the game, we're here to win it. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation. As a company, who are we? Risk Decisions Group. We work across the world. Our values, stronger together. We work with our broad community of customers, employees and people who just want to engage on risk. Adventurous. We don't advocate reckless risk-taking. We promote intelligent risk-taking. We listen to people and share, being considerate and, of course, trusted. We want to achieve great risk outcomes, So first of all, for example, I go out and do masterclasses with people, helping them define their positive risk vision that will power their organisation into the future. We also help people connect risk to make smarter decisions. By connecting risk, we mean, well, helping break down silos that are the barriers to communication and good decision making. Of course, you need to understand the perspectives. You need to understand how, if you make a decision here, how will it affect another part of the company? And of course, the vital connection of having all your risk information in one central place. Adding value, giving people the ability to see what lies in the future. Finally, engagement, to build a risk intelligent organisation, going out and working with people, doing coaching and training, so you get a return on your investment in risk. We provide our beautifully simple risk software, the modern Predict suite of integrated tools. Centrally hosted, capturing your risks, opportunities and actions, analysing, reporting and communicating across your organisation. A best-of-breed platform built to support risk intelligent decision making. You can download our risk intelligent white papers from our website. The original, that's been very well received, How Successful Leaders Thrive in an Uncertain World. And our new one, The Snowball Effect, Let's Get the Ball Rolling, that looks at the importance of middle managers in getting risk intelligent decision making off the ground. Thank you for listening. Once again, I'm Val Jonas. You can email me or connect to me on LinkedIn. We would like to support you to go further with 2020 vision and the art of risk intelligent decision making. I'm going to host a question and answers discussion session now if you have time to join us. So thank you. And any questions?
Okay, so should we start with Sandra's question then? One of the problems with risk is that people don't seem to have a view that they should fund it. Getting resources for risk is actually quite difficult often. I guess one of the best things to do is to give you an example in our customer base where I think they did a really good job on this. It was a kind of a transport organisation, but a government transport organisation, and they had quite a lot of big supply chain, but they were a very small central organisation trying to manage a lot of suppliers, a lot of contractors. And they had a really amazing guy who came in and sort of structured their risk management. And the really key thing is to keep it simple. So to start off with, he just put a structure together and just focused in on what are the key objectives they're trying to achieve. And those objectives can be quite soft. They don't necessarily need to be purely financial or pure, because in terms of local government, you're looking at the well-being and achieving great things for your communities and so on. So whatever those objectives are, get a structure, then look at how you break down the organization and just ask people to identify just a handful of risks. You don't have to have hundreds and thousands of risks. In fact, I would say any organization that's got thousands of risks are really very immature as far as risk is concerned. Either that or they're very, very mature, but usually it's the other end of the scale. And so you could just focus on a small number of risks, as the key thing is getting actions in place, getting something moving and helping people see that they really can achieve great things with risk. So looking for some quick wins. And as I say, it doesn't need to be complicated. Keep it really simple. Sandra, have you got any other thoughts on that?
So basically, it's I think it's something that you have mentioned as a key message to take from me is to keep it simple and focus on probably 2 or 3 quick wins to start changing the culture.
Yes, because that's what senior management want to see. Get them engaged. That's quite difficult, but if you talk senior, you also have to think about how senior managers think. You can't talk kind of, risk talk and risk matrices and things are not what they're into. They are much more interested in thinking about what's the risk vision, You know, what's acceptable, how do you align it, what's the objectives, what are the things that might hit your objectives, and things like that. Visualization are really good. You don't need more than about 20 items on there that are the key things. It's just you've got to get to the key things. You've got to get them interested. Okay, so any other questions? Helen.
So I was really interested to see that visualization of the risks as it just really appeals to the way I think, and I can see how doing that actually could be really useful for some of our clients. Is that a function of your software, or was that just done in kind of Visio or PowerPoint or something similar?
No, that's a part of our software now. We integrated it with a big Canadian infrastructure company, working with them because they're doing digital transformation. They work across the world, and they wanted to be able to highlight key things. They're doing really big things on helping their big customers, their big mining and infrastructure companies, on climate change and geopolitical stuff. They work in all sorts of countries around the world which have got significant issues, and they wanted to be able to pinpoint the things that are linked together, and how you might have some small risks which don't really figure on their own, but when you join them together and you show them to management and show how the links join and look at the velocity, because the circles around the items are how speedy or how fast they're going to hit you, and suddenly it really brings management to life, because they can actually see into it, and you can just sit there and drag them around and you know, pull them into a shape that's meaningful. So it is a really useful. I mean, it's new. We're only just launching it now, so we've had it worked with our customer on it for the last 6 months, and now we're releasing it.
Okay, and have you found it works well with an agile kind of approach? Because at the moment, one of the things we're finding a lot is clients want to move to a more agile project and program management style, but they see that as a bit of an excuse to kind of ignore risk perhaps more than they already do. And what we are struggling with is how to move the risk along with the other stuff and make it less static, because risk tends to be in some of the organizations we work with very, very linear, very slow moving. But obviously if you're working in an agile way and you're changing your priorities very rapidly, there's a real need to bring risk along with that and ensure that actually your risks are also able to be reprioritized quickly and have a good kind of portfolio view of all the risks, so you can do that. So do you find this works well with that?
That's not something that we've played with the new visualization, so that's a really interesting idea. I'd like to go away and think about that. But it's certainly the case that agile is transforming the way people are working with risk. I mean, my view, and you know, we've been doing agile for some time now. We are you know, working with a backlog. The only difference is that you're not actually putting that backlog of things into a structured waterfall view of when they're going to happen and you know, exactly what all the links are. But I mean, the great thing about agile is it's encouraging people to think opportunity. So we're seeing far more people actually opening their minds to new things as opposed to only thinking about the negatives. So yes, it's an interesting one, but what you need is, you know, you need a structure that is flexible. You need to be able to drag and drop things around. You know, that's one of the things that we're sort of facilitating, because we understand organizations change rapidly, and also right down to project environments, they're changing rapidly. And with agile, you need to bring things forward, push things back. And so having that simple but flexible structure is really important. So I think it's a learning curve. I think people are on that kind of, you know, it's a bit of a journey, but we are seeing people who are starting to achieve some really good things. But I would say the biggest benefit is people thinking innovation and opportunity.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That was really interesting.
Okay, has anybody else got a question? Ah, yes, Egan. What's the difference between risk proximity and risk velocity? Okay, so it kind of depends on how you want to define it. Different people define it differently. The way I define it is that risk proximity is actually how soon the risk could possibly hit you. So the earliest it might materialize. Whereas risk velocity is about how long you've got to do something about it. So even though the risk could hit you in 2 months' time, it might be that you have, the time you've got to deal with it could be 3 months or 4 months or 1 month, or So one is about the risk and the other is about the actions, in my opinion. And I think that's a little bit of a simplistic view of it, but when you're explaining things to people, trying to keep it simple is quite I think that's quite important, because people just need to have something they can grab onto. Has anybody else got a question? One of the things somebody asked me when I was coming in to do the presentation was, a question that comes up is how to get engagement with an organisation, and what examples do we have of actually engaging with leaders. And that's where I think that the kind of structured approach to getting the board on board, but also absolutely vital, is getting risk champions engaged in your organisation. So you're going to have a lot of risk champions across the organisation, and you'll probably have a champion of champions, but they are still hampered if they haven't got senior management on board. And the example that I often give is of when we were working on the 2012 Olympics with Lend-Lease. And I don't know whether John Walsh is still on the call, but he was our key customer there. We got a masterclass going. It was a very culturally interesting one, because Lend-Lease is an Australian company, so their attitude towards running the project was very Australian. Was kick people up the backside if things didn't go right. And we went in and said, actually, I think there's probably a better risked way of doing that. One of the key things that we did was work with John and another John, the two Johns, on making sure that every month we realigned and programmed the project back to 100% certainty of delivering on time. So Esther, I think one of the things you were talking about was the contextual reference, and I think you're absolutely right. I think certainly with ISO 31000 and most risk processes, context is absolutely fundamental, and that's needed in order to understand all sorts of things, not just the position you're in terms of practicalities, but also, very important, culture, the characters that influence decisions, as you said. I guess much of the chat actually went into the importance of aligning vision and values, and I also think cultural understanding is key. I always think back to my daughter, who worked in Myanmar, it must be 4 or 5 years ago now, and she was working with an NGO there, and they were building health centres in the far north of the country in very poor villages. And they thought that this is obviously a wonderful thing to do. They didn't realise that culturally the local people were superstitious about how many steps there were up to the front door, and they realised that their designs were all based on, and I can't remember whether it was an odd number of steps or an even number of steps. They couldn't understand why people weren't coming to the new health centres, and it was only when they understood that culturally people just would not walk up an odd number of steps that they had to rebuild the front of the entrance ways. And I think we just have no idea how big an impact culture has on the decisions we make, and how badly wrong we can get it. I think really it's all about aligning vision, values, and making sure that people focus on the long-term objectives, the long-term outcomes, and have really great risk conversations. You've got to trust each other to do that, and that's a hard thing to do. It takes quite a lot of personality in the risk team to get out there and sometimes knock people's heads together, and sometimes just mediate between people. But I think that's really it's really important. Did you have any more comments to make on that, Esther?
Hello, Val. Hello, everybody. I'm from Indonesia. Sorry, I am currently in Indonesia. So when we're actually talking about culture, yes, cultural as in culture is also important. But what I'm actually trying to say is when there are two companies with different kind of culture, different kind of shape and outreach, if you like, and also two different kind of compliance regime, sometimes it's very hard to align visions when it comes to a GV or anything that is put in paper as in contract, yet that yes, we are going to do that together. And that's where I think a lot of us miss what the risk to the business is. Because everyone going to the GV, they think that everything is going to be all right, we are sharing this together, but in reality, it's not. And what I am experiencing here is that a lot is like that now after COVID. I don't know whether it is the impact of COVID that now everyone is after everyone else, but the legal case in within that kind of GVs are extremely high. And that is interesting because it used to be not like that in Indonesia. I don't know whether it has anything to do with culture, that they refrain themselves from conflicts. I'm not sure. But I guess that brings up the need to think before you do things and what it actually impacting your business. Because if you don't do it at the very beginning of it, you're going down. And that's what I'm trying to say, actually.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think that comes on to the question David asked about JVs and alliances.
Yes.
And it is a really, it's a really significant problem. Only a couple of weeks ago, I was on a call with some people who were a significant sized JV here in Europe, and they wasted so much time just sitting arguing about the definition of what was the difference between a risk and an issue. And I was like, I don't know. It was so basic, and I thought, we're just getting nowhere here. I do think with JVs and alliances, there are two things that are needed. One is that you need much better risk conversations early on in the procurement process. Those risk conversations need to get you on the same page, and that's the case for any procurement. But I think the other thing is, just like you need to do set a risk vision and get aligned as a company, you actually should set your risk vision as an alliance and make sure that everybody's bought into that. You need charters. I've worked with huge projects where they've gone horribly wrong, and actually what you find is they're just not aligned. In fact, they all really want the final outcome. It's just they can't agree on how to get there, and they all have different incentives. But if you just say, okay, Chatham House rules, get around the table, talk about it, you can often resolve those issues. But it is all about having a risk vision.
Sorry, I'm actually smiling when you said that. When you said align the vision, I don't know whether it is being cynical of me or not, but when this GV, I mean, this is a case that I'm actually working on as well now. When the GV is put with the reality that they're going to have such a huge penalty and get their license retracted, then they work together. It's yeah, that's the reality, I suppose. So instead of they going after each other, now they actually have to work together, because then there goes their licenses, which is sad, but it's reality.
Yes, and I'm just writing a very brief blog article with another company who called Commerce Decisions, who help take organisations through procurements. And one of the things, the big focus we have on that is having great risk conversations during the procurement process and making sure that making sure that all of the parties are incentivized in the right way. And actually, that's partly the customer's got to do that. If it's in a JV, somebody's the customer, even if it just is stakeholders. It could be within the business or outside the business. Yeah, I think that it's, you know, too myopic a view, and I think you know, all of this stuff about, like you said, signing on the line. Before we sign on the line, we actually need to get this sorted. Otherwise, you just end up dealing with it during the contract. Well, I think probably we've got to the end of our session. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you for the great comments that you all made. Really interesting. And I wish you have a great rest of your day.